to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, a show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. As the saying goes, I'm not mad, just disappointed, both at scammers and the woefully incompetent strategies that they use to try to phish, as well as just artificial intelligence in general and some of the takes that I've heard about it. So today I figured it would be kind of interesting if we would kind of pit the two against one another. Some very embarrassing phishing attack attempts, as well as some of the things around AI, and just to see which one fails to impress more. But I'm interested to hear what all your guys' takes are. So if you're on YouTube, you can definitely leave a comment down below on what's more embarrassing. And also, if you're on podcast, you can always shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Link for that's down in the show notes as well. So definitely be sure to let me know what your thoughts are. But before we get into that, let's start off with our trivia question. So this one's a bit of a fun one. So on June 15th, 2011, what hacker group launched an attack on CIA.gov, which is the public website of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, taking the website offline with a distributed denial of service attack, which lasted between 8:48 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time? So what was the name of that hacker group that performed that attack? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, I guess before we get into the cybersecurity tip, we should touch on that the embarrassing new low for scammers in their phishing attempts, since it is also in the realm of cybersecurity. So this week, I got a text message, and it was for a one-time passcode for an account, which, you typically get those. Now, I did not try to log into said account, so obviously that's kind of, raises a couple red flags there. One, I didn't try to sign into it, so this is either a scam or someone actually tried to potentially log into my account. But the message said that if you didn't request, this code to call this number, I guess it makes sense. If you didn't request that code, you might want to contact the company responsible and maybe inquire if your account has been compromised, perhaps. But like, what's the big deal here? This is just kind of like typical scammer stuff. But ladies and gentlemen, this was a group text message. It was not a text message sent to me. It was a text message sent to me, and I want to say around like 8 or so other individuals. And it was from a just regular old phone number. It wasn't from one of those automated 5-digit numbers that you typically get these automated text messages from. And that's another thing. It wasn't even a text message. It wasn't even an SMS message. It was an RCS message. So yet another red flag. So not only are we asking you to call a number that is different from the number that is sending you the code, which, I mean, I guess that's not super out of the ordinary, because if it was, say, coming from a 5-digit number, you would expect, obviously, if they ask you to call a phone number, it would be different. So I'm not going to dox them a ton of points there. I mean, it's still kind of like, come on, man, really? But it's not like, immediately disqualified, what on earth are you thinking type of a deal. Like some of these other ones, like the group messaging thing, man. Come on. Like, what are you doing? Do you really think... Like I get, there are some people out there that might not be as technically savvy and are more susceptible to phishing attacks like this. But I think most people are smart enough to realize that they don't necessarily know that something is wrong, but they have the idea of, well, usually when I get a text message for my one-time passcode, it's from a 5-digit number and it's only sent to me. Why is this in a group text? So it's probably going to be setting off some questions in their head, even if they're not immediately going to, yep, this is obviously a scam and these people aren't even trying anymore. So it was RCS, not SMS. So yet again, another red flag. And yeah, so I I have no idea what this scammer was thinking when they were trying this, but this probably has to be one of the most embarrassing attempts at a phishing attack that I have ever seen. Like, this honestly makes the whole Nigerian prince thing look like an absolute masterclass in phishing attempts, because this is like, lowest effort possible, like even below that. Like, the thing that still gets me is the fact it was a group text message, and not even an SMS message, a group RCS text message group that you sent this in. Like, what on earth were you thinking? Like, come on, man. What are you doing? But the funny thing about it was I was actually driving at the time, and so I see this, group text message come up, and I didn't necessarily think too much of it. I just kind of assumed that it was some other group I was in with some numbers that I didn't recognize, because I am a part of a few of those. So I didn't necessarily think a whole lot of it. And then I got home, checked the thread, and that's when I figured out, this was a woefully, embarrassingly bad attempt at a phishing attack. But the funny thing is, because it was an RCS message, RCS, if you're not aware, it gives you kind of similar functionality like iMessage does if you're on iPhones. So you can actually leave groups that you're in, unlike SMS text message groups. So by the time I actually got around to looking at this thread, one of the numbers had already left the group, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. So I'm pretty sure that every county, city, waste management authority have current active and open investigations for information on that rancid, steaming hot pile of garbage that this group or individual called a social engineering attack. So those waste management authorities can promptly remove it into the trash heap with the rest of the garbage where it belongs, because it was so bad. So I'm interested to hear if you have had any woefully, embarrassingly bad phishing attempt stories like that. If you have, definitely be sure to let me know. If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment, or you can always shoot me an email. That is down in the show notes below if you are on podcast. But with that, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. So if I was going to shortchange you guys this week on cybersecurity tips, I probably would have used that last one with the whole phishing scam thing and, talking about the red flags, and just called it a day. But I got a better one for you. And this week's cybersecurity tip is to not underestimate the power of OSINT, or open source intelligence. Now, I think we've talked about OSINT before, but OSINT is one of those things that any hacker does before they go after someone. So specifically, if you're talking about social engineering type attacks, where you're trying to identify what might make a certain individual susceptible to a social engineering attack, to a potential spear phishing campaign, what you do is you gather as much information as you can about them that is free and open to the public. Now, how you get your hands on this can vary in a number of ways, but typically how you go about doing this is you identify some information that you know about the person that's generally, I guess, public knowledge, we'll say, and then based off that, you basically do some digging on the interwebs, and find as much information about that person as you can. So let's say hypothetically you wanted to go after someone and you didn't know any of their social media accounts or anything like that, but you knew what their name was, you maybe knew their general location, and maybe you knew what their occupation was. Just some basic info. So basically, what you would do in an OSINT situation is you would basically throw all that into a search query in your search engine of choice, maybe doing some advanced search techniques like with quotes and things like that. And then eventually you'll probably find something, get you down some rabbit holes of some possible candidates for your potential victim that you're trying to get information on. Now, one thing that's kind of key in that is if you know the person's name, even just their first name, even if you don't know their last name, just their first name, general location, and occupation, assuming they have a LinkedIn, you can pretty much have a field day there and find them. No, I'm not going to say easily, but it'll depend. I guess it depends on what their first name is. But especially if it's not a very common first name, you'll probably be able to find them pretty easily. And then once you find that, you already know their name, you have a picture of them, you know what to look for, and that, assuming of course you don't already know what they look like. And then after that, I mean, it's just pick the next social media platform you want and just keep on hopping. And who knows, maybe they'll have other links on their various social media accounts to other things of theirs. Like maybe if they're a software engineer, maybe they have their GitHub, linked there. If they have like a YouTube channel or something, maybe you can find that as well. Tons of information, and all of that is freely available to anyone on the internet. So that kind of gets to the point though, where if you don't want anyone trying to get all this information on you, first off, don't put anything on the internet, number one. But if you have put stuff on the internet, then your best bet is to basically give as little information about yourself to everyone as possible so they can't. It makes it a lot harder for them to look things up about you. Now, depending on the platform you're using and whatnot, if someone has a picture of you, they might be able to do some kind of like reverse image search to try to find similar photos, and they can kind of track you down that way. But again, that's just another like OSINT tactic that people will use. But yeah, but I mean, once they kind of identify you, like say, they knew your occupation, your name, and where you were located, say found you on LinkedIn. At that point, it's basically like fish in a barrel, and you're basically cooked at that point. The attacker or whoever is trying to gather info on you can basically get whatever they want that's available on your public profiles, or if you have any kind of like personal websites, like I mentioned GitHub for instance, linked there, they'll be able to find that as well. So yes, remember, if you ever are having casual interactions with people, definitely be wary of what kind of information you give them, because even the smallest things that you might not even think would be able to easily identify you, all those little bits and pieces combined together in aggregate create a pretty good profile of you. And that's, in essence, how, the big social media platforms get and do such a good job of harvesting data about people and kind of identifying what you might like and what you don't, because you might like a single post over here, you might share a photo over there, and while those two things might not seem correlated at all, because of the fancy schmancy algorithms behind the scenes, they can kind of correlate those two things and kind of get a sense of more information about you than you might want them to know. And the same thing goes with OSINT too. People can do that as well. So definitely be very wary of the type of information that you give out about yourself. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, before we talk about artificial intelligence, we did have a rather large and notable news story that passed us by last week while we were too busy admiring in awe of Craig Federighi's beautiful hair and his beautiful antics at WWDC. But last week, you might have noticed, I believe it was on Thursday, on June 12th, the internet was having a little bit of trouble. And the reason why the internet was having a little bit of trouble was because Google had a little oopsie on Thursday, and it took down a decent amount of sites across the entire internet. Cloudflare, of course, being one of them. And if you know anything about Cloudflare, they are kind of one of the biggest DNS providers in the world, and essentially what that means for those who aren't as technically knowledgeable, what DNS allows you to do is it allows you to go to your web browser, type in the name of a website, say google.com, and it will take you there because DNS is able to do all the lookups required to give your computer and your web browser the numbers that it needs to get to where it's trying to go. That is a very oversimplification, but the point is the internet is made up of IP addresses, and the domain name system, or DNS, is basically a way that us humans don't have to memorize a bunch of numbers. We can just memorize words, and it makes it a lot easier for us to find things. So if DNS goes down, it's going to be a royal pain to find anything on the internet. Now, that's not necessarily to say because you can't get to a website, it is down, because again, it could just be a DNS issue. But in this case, there is a chance that the website actually might have been down because Google had, like I said, a little oopsie. So that's the big deal why Cloudflare having issues is a big deal. So I'll have a link to an analysis done, which I think is pretty good and pretty in depth by 1,000 Eyes. So I'll have that linked down in the show notes if you want to go look at it. But according to their analysis, on May 29th of this year, Google apparently rolled out some new code intended to enhance their service control functionality, introducing additional quota policy checks. But apparently that code, I guess, didn't go through enough rigorous testing or code review or whatever the case may be, because there was a particular piece of code in there that remained dormant during the initial rollout phase, that as basically during potential like policy modifications, it could be activated. And apparently, I guess in their testing, they didn't kind of write a test case or something to kind of catch that edge case. So this particular piece of code was untested and, as we will see shortly, was not working. So then on June 12th, which was when the oopsie happened, a critical event triggered the dormant code when a policy change was made to the regional spanner tables that the service control depends on. The spanner, which is Google's globally distributed database system, is engineered to replicate data in real time across multiple data centers worldwide. So essentially what this is saying is when Google wants to push an update to one of their servers, it's able to kind of mass deploy across their entire infrastructure. So this policy change inadvertently introduced unintended blank fields, in quotes, into the spanner table fields, which were empty and not properly initialized. Big red flag right there. When service control attempted to execute the new code in conjunction with these altered policies, it encountered a significant issue. A code path that led to a null pointer dereference. We always love those. In other words, the code tried to use data that did not exist, causing it to crash. Yes, so the classic example of not thoroughly checking your edge cases on perfect display there. So the error resulted in a crash, which the reason why this is important though is because typically when your program encounters an error, you want to be able to catch that error and be able to handle it gracefully. But if your program just straight up crashes, you can't catch the error and handle it gracefully and return to normal operations. So that was basically what was going on here, and what was causing the massive issue. So according to Google, the issue was with their however you say it, their identity and access management service. So this is basically what's responsible for accessing accounts, accessing APIs, authorization, policy enforcement, amongst other things. So a pretty big deal when it comes to the cloud space. So if your service relies on the Google Cloud API at all, which obviously if you're using the Google Cloud, you would be for accessing things like your data stores, your queues, whatever you're using in Google Cloud. So if you bring down all of IAM, you basically don't allow access to basically anything on the cloud platform. And as you can kind of see, this causes a cascading effect. Because if your service is running on Google Cloud and is making API calls to Google Cloud, but it can't authenticate itself for those API calls because the IAM system is down, you're obviously going to see how you're going to start to run into some issues and your website might not be performing like it's supposed to be. Um, so the main issue was going back to that null dereference because the system was actually crashing rather than being able to properly handle the error. That was inevitably what was causing this big outage and this big issue. So yeah, that was the oopsie that Google had, but this is not Google's first major oopsie. I would argue this one actually isn't nearly as bad as their one they had last year, almost a year to the day. But I guess they were a month off. So if you remember to last year, I'm not sure if we covered it on the podcast or not. But last year, Google's big oopsie then was they somehow managed, some event happened in their cloud. I'm not sure what it was, but they had some event happen that completely wiped UniSuper's account and all of its backups. So basically, an entire account on Google Cloud got completely destroyed along with all of its backups, which that is just massive. But the reason why it was so bad was because this UniSuper account was the account that was in charge of managing Australia's pension fund that controlled $135 billion dollars and had over 645,000 members associated with it. So this was no small oopsie that Google ran into last year. And yeah, a year and about a month or so later, they have another rather large oopsie. Um, so I guess what do you I'm not sure like really what the point of this was. I just thought it was an interesting story because I like kind of clowning on companies that I don't particularly like all that much. But the I guess the kind of the question here is what should you do about your cloud provider? Now, I would argue that maybe just not use Google. But again, of course, I'm biased in that regard. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into all the details about which cloud provider you should pick because first off, that's a very kind of personal choice for you. And if you're working for a company, your company's needs, because every company and every individual is going to be different on what features they're going to prioritize, what their budget is, what kind of value proposition they're looking for. So what kind of reliability. So there's a lot of, factors you have to take into account. So I'm not going to, go into the weeds and kind of give you a recommendation. But for me personally, like in my home lab solution, personally, I use Akamai, formerly known as Linode. I don't necessarily have any strong ties or feelings towards them. The main reason I went with their platform was because their business model, at least for like I think they call them their Linodes, is like their VPS solutions or their virtual private servers. Depending on like what size you get, it's a fixed dollar amount every month, so you don't have to worry about one month it being basically nothing and the next month it being a lot higher. It's always just kind of a fixed amount. So it's kind of nice always knowing how much I'm going to get charged every month. And that's basically the reason I went with them. Wasn't really for the feature set or anything like that. So I guess take that as you will. But again, like I said, I'm not here to, recommend them. They didn't pay me or anything. Use whatever provider you want. Use Azure, use AWS, use Akamai, use Hetzner, use, whatever you want. But maybe not use Google. I guess unless you maybe want your service to go down or potentially have your entire account get destroyed and all of its backups. But with that, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this week I was doing some infrastructure work as well. So I guess I'm kind of in the same boat as Google. There were some outages, I guess you could say, going on in my infrastructure, specifically my VPS, my virtual private server. So let's just say my Notify server was spotty at best in terms of how it was actually working. So I eventually diagnosed the issue to be that my VPS was running a very outdated version of Docker that just happened to come with the version of Ubuntu server that it was running. So basically, a lot of the stuff that I was trying to do wasn't supported, and things were basically not booting up properly. Essentially, the containers weren't coming up like they were supposed to. Thankfully, I have a fancy dancy, very helpful Ansible playbook that installs the proper, correct version of Docker across a bunch of different platforms. So basically, literally all I had to do was uninstall the version of Docker that the server had, and then basically run this Ansible playbook against it, and then within like less than 10 minutes, everything was back up and running. Notify was back up and running, and all the other Docker containers that I had running on there were also back up and running. And it was very, very simple, which have I mentioned before on the podcast how much I love Ansible? Because this is one of the reasons why I love it so much, because I wrote this playbook once to install Docker, and I have used it multiple times, and it has been a lifesaver because it makes the install process so much easier than having to manually type out all the commands. But then basically after I reinstalled Docker, I pretty much just went into each one of the different directories where my Docker Compose files were, just ran a quick Docker Compose up-d, and basically everything was back up and running in no time. So it was pretty amazing. The other thing that I also realized was broken was my search engine that I spun up. I think it's a Cirex NG container stack, and basically the issue was similar to one of my personal websites where the SSL certificate expired. So I was trying to kind of figure out and mess around with how to get that working again. I did eventually get it working. It basically ended up being I was using like an outdated config file, I think is basically what it ended up being. So got that switched over, and basically everything's working now. So yeah, a lot of kind of infrastructure-y, I guess, type fixes this week. But it's always nice, when you see something not working and then you mess around with some stuff, tweak a couple things, and it starts working again. So that was definitely very rewarding. And those were some of the nerdy things that I got up to this week. Now let's move into the other thing that fails to impress, which that is AI. And if I'm being honest, I'm kind of getting sick of talking about it. And if you're listening to this, I would not be surprised if you are kind of getting sick of hearing about it, because that's basically all companies, like especially tech companies, but just kind of companies in general, have been pushing for the past how many years now? 3, 4 years? I don't even remember. Basically, ever since like OpenAI came out with ChatGPT, I think it was 3, kind of made that public, and AI just kind of blew up, and everyone's like, "Oh, we got to do everything AI," and then it just kind of took over. So it's been kind of getting maybe a little it's getting a little old, I think, because I don't know about you guys, but at least for me and the use cases that I would think of using it for, it really hasn't improved that much. Now, maybe your use cases are different than mine, but for me, I haven't really noticed that significant of a difference between, say, the first version of ChatGPT and the latest and greatest models that are coming out these days. And the other thing, the other reason why I wanted to kind of touch on this again is because it shouldn't be, I don't think it's a huge secret that tech companies have been laying off a large volume of their workforce in the past couple years. And there have also been commentators as well, basically commenting on the fact that, oh, AI is going to take your jobs, even you software developers aren't safe. And don't get me wrong, um, under like very strict scrutiny and guidelines, AI can do a decent job of doing what you want it to. Um, but like for example, like if I one thing that I am terrible at doing is writing grammatically correct sentences and writing things in active versus passive voice. So one thing that AI would be pretty good at would be is if I took one of my terribly concocted sentences or paragraphs, fed it to an AI, and would be like, "Hey, correct the grammatical mistakes in this sentence." It would do a pretty good job at fixing my grammatical errors. And then I could basically feed it back to it and be like, okay, now change the passive voice sentences to active voice. And it would probably do a pretty darn good job at that. But again, those are very strict uh, scenarios, a lot of scrutiny involved in strict, tight guidelines in play of what the AI is supposed to do. It's not like kind of a free and open, hey, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, and you don't kind of really give it any criteria. Because when you do that, that's when it really starts to fall apart. So I guess if you're one of those kind of like AI gurus and you're like some like super uber prompt engineer or something, maybe this is a non-issue for you. I don't know. But at least in my experience and kind of what I've been hearing, some commentators say is there's a lot of fear mongering going on out there. Basically saying that developers are going to be out of a job because AI is coming for their jobs imminently. And to those commentators, I say you need a serious reality check because I'm not sure if you've tried to use an AI to write code for you, but I sure have. And boy, oh boy, is it horrible. Now, granted, like I said, under very strict scrutiny and very tight guidelines, it's actually pretty decent, but you're not going to be doing very much if you can give those super strict tight guidelines because it takes a software engineer to know what those super strict and tight guidelines are in order to get semi decent results. Because one thing these AIs are horrible at is open-ended solutions. So for instance, if you asked an AI to, so if your boss comes to you and says, "Hey, here is this, problem we need you to solve and here is, the acceptance criteria and, this is what the current state is, figure out a solution." If you give that exact prompt to an AI, it's probably not even going to spit out anything remotely close to a solution. And that's assuming what it even spits out even compiles, because it probably won't. Um, so, uh, like the thing is it can write decent code for things like auto completion or potentially, writing basic things like getter and setter methods. So one thing that it typically isn't too bad at is if you have it integrated into your IDE and you like write a comment about what this next section of code's going to do, it'll generally create something that's pretty decent. Is it going to be perfect? it's not guaranteed, but generally speaking, it'll at least kind of get the right idea, especially if you're very thorough in your comment and your comment is about something very basic. Like, for instance, if your comment was for loop to iterate over this array and, set the ID to something else, it would do a pretty good job at writing code that would actually do that adequately. But you get more complex than that, it just falls apart. The other problem with it too is the fact that like if you just ask it a very broad thing, right? Like I've mentioned that, say your boss comes to you and it's like, hey, here's this problem that we need you to solve, whatnot. If you give that to an AI and if you put yourself in a software developer mindset or a software engineer mindset and you kind of figure out what kind of implementation you want to do and kind of prompt the AI in that regard, there's a chance that it might get the general idea, and in theory what it wrote looks like it could work. But then, of course, you go to compile it and it just doesn't. But the other thing, too, is especially if you're dealing with like a proprietary code base or basically anything that isn't like in the standard part of the language. So if you're not dealing with something that's like a built-in function or a built-in type or a built-in class to a given programming language, the chances that the AI is going to completely make up a function name is pretty high. Now, in fairness to the AI, which if you actually know how these things work, it's not surprising that they do this. The function that they'll try to call makes absolute sense given the context that it's trying to write the code in. The problem is that function doesn't exist because it just made it up. And this is what we call a hallucination. And the reason why it hallucinates this is, as we've talked about before on the podcast, all these large language models is just a calculus program running in the background that predicts what the most likely next word is going to be. So in this case, if you're writing a function, you're writing a program, and you want to say pull something from a database, you're trying to pull, say, the ID from the database, right? So in theory, you would think that there's probably going to be some like get table ID function or something like that. Like, so if you're looking through code and you saw it, well commented, well documented, and you see this, call with like the database class dot, get table ID with like a parameter, that would make complete sense to you. Like that's how you would kind of typically write it. It kind of all makes sense with the logic of the program, but that function just doesn't exist. Now, sure, you could write it, but you might not have the ability to write that function because you're using an API or you're using an SDK somewhere or using an already compiled library that you have no control over. So the thing with these, but that's just kind of like the best case scenario where theoretically if you're just reading through the code it makes sense until you actually start digging into it and realizing, oh yeah, that function doesn't exist. Oh yeah, that's actually not how you do this at all. Oh yeah, this should actually be in a try catch statement. No, you shouldn't be using a for loop for that. And you quickly can pick apart the code and realize how absolutely horrendous it actually is. Now, like I said, if you give it super, super, super strict guidelines of what it's supposed to do and have it only generate small snippets for you, that's one thing, and it generally speaking does a pretty good job at it. But if you want it to generate a large amount of code for you, like it theoretically would need to do if it's supposed to replace software engineers, it falls apart very, very quickly. Um, so hopefully I've kind of nailed that bit home, and I think we'll come back to that a little bit, but I wanted to give kind of another example. I've been beating down AI and how terrible it is. But one thing that I wanted to also kind of bring up here is the fact that I mentioned quite frequently how what it spits out looks, in theory, like it should actually be pretty good and pretty decent. And that's the problem with AI, right? We've talked about it on the podcast before. If you have no idea what you're asking it and it spits out an answer to you, you're almost certainly going to think, yeah, that makes total and legit sense. I mean, sounds right to me. Because again, it's very confident in its algorithm because again, it's just a calculation going on in the background to predict what the most likely next word's going to be. So of course, it's going to sound very confident in its answer. But unless you have the knowledge background to pick out, what's nonsense and what's actually legitimate, you have no way of knowing. And it's the same thing if you ask an AI to write code for you. If you've never written code in your life, you're going to see what it spits out and you're going to think it's an absolute genius. And yes, all the software engineers are going to be out of a job in the next year. But if you actually know how to write code and you know the code base you're working in, and you see the code that an AI spits out for you, especially if you're asking for a very broad, large amount of code to be spit out, you are very, very, very underwhelmed. But going back to an instance where it actually could be useful, not too long ago, I was trying to, in a concise manner, articulate what ASLR was, or address space layout randomization, which is essentially, the thing, like it's on Linux, where like basically anytime your program runs, the address space that your program is running in is different. So the return addresses are going to be different from run to run. The memory locations for your variables are going to be different, etc. Now, I was kind of struggling on how to kind of word this in a concise manner that wasn't overly rambly and was just kind of straight and to the point. So I asked an AI to do it. I was like, hey, give me a concise explanation for what ASLR is. And it spit out something that was pretty good. And the reason why I actually was comfortable doing that was because I had the background knowledge of what ASLR actually was, so I could read its answer and detect, no, that that part right there, that's not exactly how that works. Or I could be like, yeah, that's actually a pretty good explanation. I'll go with that. Maybe tweak some things to fit my style a little bit more. But that's kind of the mindset that you have to use AI in these days, because unless you are knowledgeable on the subject or you are willing to put in your own research, it is not advisable to just blindly ask it questions and take its results as gospel, because I have heard so many commentators, repeatedly, they'll be like, well, I'm not sure what that is. Let's ask the AI, see what it says. It's like, every time I hear that, I just roll my eyes because I'm like, oh boy, how much of what it's actually saying is actually legitimate here? Because as we all know, they are very, very good at making stuff up and doing it in a very convincing manner. And again, if you don't know what's true and what's not, you'll have no way of knowing if what it's actually telling you is legitimate. So for me personally, whenever I use AI in those types of use cases, I always make sure that I have some kind of background knowledge in the subject that I'm asking it about, in order to actually be able to check it to make sure it's not spewing lies to me, because I have caught it on a couple occasions where it has done that, and if I didn't have that background knowledge, I would have had absolutely no idea. It's so I guess one other thing that I can kind of allude it to is, it's kind of like, if you so here's a hypothetical, right? Say you have never had a child before, and one day you decided to engage your parents in a discussion about parenting, and you start going off about all the the ways that you should parent kids, and best practices and all that kind of stuff. In your mind, you sound like an absolute genius, but to your parents, they're probably, of course, they're probably not gonna, call you an idiot. they're probably going to be very supportive, and they're like, well, if that's the way you think about it, one of those very, non-inflammatory type responses where they're trying to be nice, but we all know in the back of their minds they're thinking, oh, you just wait, or yeah, it doesn't really work like that, or yeah, we thought so too, but that's not really the best way to do things. So it's that you need the experience and the background knowledge, because it's like if you've ever given a presentation on something and you have no idea what you're talking about, but if you say it very confidently, people will think you know what you're talking about. But if you give that same presentation in a room full of people that know the subject matter very well, they'll be very quick to call you out on everything that you get wrong. So it's kind of a similar thing here. But when it goes back, coming back a second to the whole AI is going to replace software engineers, one thing that commentators, I don't think they realize when they make these comments is AI's context bubbles are limited. Like, an AI can't just understand everything and keep it in its context because there's this thing called memory limitations that exist in the world. Computers and graphics cards can only hold so much memory in them. Eventually, you're going to have to throw some things out, and that's potentially valuable context that would potentially aid in the AI's answer to your question. So, specifically when it comes to coding, an AI has to be able to understand not only how to write functional code, but also has to understand how all the code in the given code base actually works. And depending on how big your code base is, that could be a extremely large amount of context for the AI to understand. And that's not even mentioning if you're not using like external libraries or APIs or things like that, because that's even additional context that the AI has to have in its contextual bubble. So you'll quickly see that this contextual bubble of the things that the AI needs to know in order to adequately write code for your code base grows very, very fast, very, very quickly. So and so that's problem number one, because one thing that I think I touched on a little bit already, but one thing that I have found is if I'm asking an AI to help me write a function for something that uses some kind of custom class. So if I say, hey, I want you to use this class, and do X, Y, and Z with it, it very, very regularly completely makes up methods for that class that do not exist. And any programmer that actually knows the code base would know that those methods do not exist. But again, it goes back to the whole thing that technically, if that method of that name existed, yeah, I could see why it would make sense to be calling that here, but it doesn't exist. So you can't use it. Now, again, that could potentially be a case where maybe maybe that's a function you want to add for that specific use case, but again, it kind of goes back to, do you even have the ability to implement that in the first place? So that's kind of the main gripe that I have. What one well, one of them that I have with AI is how frequently it likes to create methods that, quite frankly, do not exist. And the other thing I mentioned too is I know they're constantly coming out with new models, well, whether it's OpenAI, whether it's Anthropic, whether it's whoever, they're always coming out with new models, Google with their Gemini. But to me, it seems like they're not really getting any better. Like, maybe I'm not the AI guru that you are, but for me, I'm still running into the same issues, right? I ask AI to write basic code, it can't do it. I ask it for information about a certain topic, it makes stuff up. And I don't necessarily think that's gonna go away anytime soon, because because again, the core functionality of how these models work is purely math based and predicting what the most likely next word's going to be. It has absolutely no idea what it's talking about. It's just running an algorithm calculation in the background and calculating what the most probable next word's going to be given some alleged context that it has, which is, again, is basically just a glorified numbers and weights in the background. So now, sure, I guess one thing I will give AIs and large language models credit for is over the past couple years, they aren't quite as robotic as they used to be. You're not going to be quite as likely to see as a large language model, blah, 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 blah. They're generally a little more conversational now. So I will give them that. They have kind of advanced in that regard. But as far as their intelligence goes, I still kind of find it a little bit lacking. But maybe, just maybe, that's why Apple, with their whole Apple intelligence, hasn't really gotten off the ground, because maybe the bar in the industry is just that low that it hasn't ascended to Apple's bar yet, whatever that bar happens to be. Because after all, Craig Federighi did mention the reason why their features that they promised last year at WWDC didn't ship yet was because they couldn't reach Apple's high bar for their standards. Again, I think we could make the argument that there was a little more to it than just the AI not meeting their standards. If you believe the rumors, there was apparently some turmoil going on with inside Apple. Um, but I guess this does kind of beg the question of what level does AI have to get to before I would be comfortable saying, yeah, software engineer jobs might be at risk? Well, first off, it has to be able to write code and not use functions that don't exist. If because like because even if you are a junior developer, if you're new to programming, I'm pretty confident in saying you're not going to write functions that don't exist in your code, because one, you're probably at the point in your experience level where you don't know what functions even exist in the first place. So you're constantly looking up the documentation to figure out what functions to use. So you're not going to be making up a random function that doesn't exist. So in that regard, AI is even worse than like people that have never programmed before and are just learning to code, because those people don't make up functions that don't exist. The second thing that I think AI has to do in order for me to get to the point where I would be comfortable saying, yeah, software engineer jobs might be at risk, is it has to be able to accomplish fairly complex problem solving with a moderate level of ambiguity, and maybe some success criteria. And it should be able to write code to solve that problem without much, if any, intervention from an actual software engineer that knows what they're doing. Because right now, you can get artificial intelligence to write code for you that works, but it takes a lot of coaching and effort and knowledge from the software engineer behind the scenes to correct it and really push it in the right direction. Because if you just kind of, gave it to a layman that doesn't know anything about programming and tell the AI to write code for you, this is where you get into the whole vibe coding nonsense, and it's spitting out absolute spaghetti garbage that might work, but the larger and larger it gets, the more unwieldy it gets, and even the AI can't even keep track of everything, again, because of that context that it has to keep everything in. It's very limited. So, unless it gets to the point where I can basically take what a boss would tell me in terms of what features it wants me to implement, like for instance, one thing that's very common for software developers to get is tickets, whether you're using a custom ticketing solution, whether you're using Jira or whatever your ticketing solution is. Typically, you'll have some kind of ticket, and it'll be either a bug fix, a feature request, or something like that, that basically will lay out the problem at hand. Like, what is the goal? Like, what is the description of the task? What are you trying to accomplish? Maybe some success criteria of this has to do X, Y, and Z. And basically, based off that, go implement this for me in the code base. So until you can basically feed that into an AI and it can basically write code that will work with very, very minimal human intervention, I'm not confident in saying that it's gunning for software engineer jobs, because as it currently stands, you cannot do that, and it will not give you code that is even remotely close to being functional. It just can't. Now, I guess depending on how strict your function out, like maybe perhaps if you get one of those, very kind of vague and ambiguous, feature request type things, and you write, some requirements for it and kind of write up a spec design, and you kind of give a very thorough, thought to how it should be designed, maybe some pseudocode and whatnot, and then feed that to an AI. You might have some better luck with that, but even still, I have some serious doubts that it would actually be able to create anything remotely close to functional without some serious human intervention on your part, to kind of coach it in the right direction of, getting things to work and whatnot. Now, when I say that it shouldn't have require much human intervention, what I kind of intend by this is, it sh- you shouldn't need a computer science degree and a background in writing software in order to get the AI to produce high quality code that solves these problems. Because right now, that's absolutely what you need, and even still, it takes a lot of effort. So until we get to the point where your average Joe off the street can basically talk with an AI to get it to, implement these kinds of features that have, moderate levels of ambiguity, maybe some success criteria, but in general isn't like fully fleshed out and very strict guidelines associated with how it should be done. Until it can do that basically by itself, I just don't see software engineers losing their jobs anytime soon. Now, you could make the argument that you won't need as many of them with AI, because AI can potentially accelerate the workflows of existing software engineers. So if that's the argument you're trying to take, I would be a little more receptive to that. Just because if you know what you're doing with the AI and having it, basically write the the very boring stuff that is very trivial that you don't want to spend the time writing, that can absolutely speed up your workflow for sure. But when it comes to writing, complex implementations of things, AI is just not there at all. So until it gets to the point where it can basically do it all without a bunch of babying and hand holding on the behalf of the developer, I would argue that it's not really gunning for software engineer jobs, at least at this time. Um, but but there's a reason why I kind of brought this up in the first place, and it's because, on this podcast, we typically talk, not exclusively, but largely just on various types of software development type things, home labbing type things, just technology in general, some cybersecurity. And the reason why we talk about that is because that is what my background is in. That's what my knowledge is in, and that's what I kind of know what I'm talking about. That's why you don't hear me commenting on things like science topics or politics or culture or anything like that. It's not because I don't have my own opinions. It's just, one, you probably don't care, and two, I don't have the knowledge to actually make adequate arguments for those, and I would probably look like the same I'd basically look like an AI, right? I would be saying stuff. Some of it might have absolutely no bearing on the truth, because I might say something that I think is accurate, but someone with knowledge in the field would be like, "Yep, nope, that's not how that works. That's not true," and then I would look like an idiot. Now, granted, I probably do that enough anyway on this podcast because I do make mistakes from time to time, and nobody is perfect, especially me. But I'm more confident in talking about something I actually have a background in, compared to something that just happens to come up. But of course, not everyone, I guess, subscribes to that same idea, which is why I'll hear people that have absolutely no background in technology whatsoever making like wildish and outlandish comments about something, like AI in particular in this case, which I guess it's like if you're a doctor and you have a patient come to you and they're basically telling you, how their treatment should go, and they're basically kind of lecturing you on medical advice, and you're like, "Wait a second. I thought I was the professional here." And you kind of quickly realize like, yeah, there's a reason that I went to school for this and you didn't, because you got a few things wrong in there. Um, but yeah, so that's not to say that just because you don't have a background in computer science doesn't mean you're not entitled to your own opinions about AI, because you absolutely are. You can say whatever the heck you want. I honestly don't care. Um, but the thing is, at the same time, kind of in the back of my mind, when I do hear some of these arguments get made, when I just kind of know, how this stuff actually works, and I'm just, thinking to myself, yeah, that's not how that works. It does not work like that. Nope. So yeah, so it kind of, I guess, like I said, goes back to that analogy of like you and your parents, because the point is, you might think you know what you're talking about, but the reality is, unless you actually have experience in the kind of the field that you're talking about, it doesn't even have to be education based, because there are plenty of people out there that are wizards when it comes to programming, and they don't really have any kind of formal education at all. So you don't necessarily need a degree from some university to prove that you know stuff. I have advocated so many times on this podcast that degrees basically don't mean anything, at least in my opinion. Like, to an extent, sure. But at the end of the day, I don't care that you have a piece of paper that says you know how to do stuff. I want to actually see you demonstrating that you know how to do stuff. Because it's, I guess, going back to AI, right? It's so easy nowadays. To basically just use that as kind of like a crutch to kind of get your way through things. And it was the same thing, back in my day, when I was going through school, and Stack Overflow was the big thing, right? Everyone was copying code from Stack Overflow. And I actually did hear a story one time in college where a professor apparently found one of their students. I don't know if it was specifically Stack Overflow or not, but basically prompting, asking the question for the exact school assignment that they had. And the professor basically gave them the entire solution. And then the student turned that solution in and got busted for plagiarism, which kind of funny. But even back then, before AI was a thing, uh, computer science students would always copy and paste code all around, and copy from Stack Overflow and other sources, copy it from GitHub, and it was a big thing even back then. So just because you have a computer science degree doesn't prove to me that you actually know how to code, because I have the experience of going through and dealing with students in computer science programs, and I know, just because they might be in a computer science degree and maybe even get their degree doesn't necessarily mean they're the brightest programmers, I guess I'll say. Um, so yeah, it really comes down to what your knowledge is, and that's why typically, especially in kind of public settings like this, because technically, this podcast is open to anyone that wants to listen to it. It's free and open to the public. So I'm not going to go out and, spouting things in subject matters that I don't really have much experience in, because then I'll just look like a complete idiot to someone that actually has experience in that area. So I guess my advice to the commentators out there, if you're going to make comments and talk about things that are out of your wheelhouse, maybe bring in an expert in the field in order to actually have that conversation with, so they can, make sure you're going in the right direction when you're making your comments. Now, I know there are plenty of shows and things out there where people do exactly that, but just kind of as, I guess, a general rule of thumb. If you aren't knowledgeable about something and you want to talk about it, especially in like a public setting, get someone that has kind of experience in it, or at the very least, if you're like on a podcast or something and you do want to talk about something out of your wheelhouse, you can always go back to what you learned in grade school. Cite your sources, and kind of do your due diligence, do your homework, and kind of make a well-formed argument that way. But definitely don't be just spewing off the cuff like an AI and making stuff up, because to someone that doesn't have a background, you might sound like an absolute genius. But to someone that has a background, the illusion falls apart pretty quickly, just like with AI responses. So which for you has been more embarrassing? Has it been AI over the past few years, or has it been scammers, social engineering, and phishing attacks? So I'd be interested to hear that. If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below, or you can shoot me an email if you're on podcast. The link for that is down in the show notes. But before we go for today, let us return to our trivia question. So this week's trivia question is: on June 15th in 2011, what hacker group launched an attack on CIA.gov, which is, of course, the United States Central Intelligence's website, taking it offline with a distributed denial of service attack, which lasted between 8:45 p.m. and 8 p.m. Eastern Time? If you said lolsec, you are correct. It's a fantastic name. Their I guess logo, if you will, at least on Wikipedia, is kind of cool. It's a nice meme. So yeah, that was the trivia question for this week. Definitely, I think probably a harder one, unless you're kind of in the hacker space and you kind of read up on hacker history, I guess. But yeah, that's going to do it for this episode. So if you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave a rating and review, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And definitely be sure to leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this episode, or if you have any topics or ideas or comments or anything for future episodes. Again, if you're listening on podcast, you can also email me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Again, the link for that is down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.